welcome to a brand new episode of Seize the Moment podcast. Today we have a very special guest. Today we have on David Edmonds. He's a writer and philosopher whose many critically acclaimed books have been translated into more than 24 languages. He's the author of The Murder of Professor Schlick and Would You Kill the Fat Man, and the co-author with John Eidinow of the international bestseller Wittgenstein's Poker. He and Nigel Warburton co-host the popular Philosophy Bites podcast, and his new book, available now, is called Parfit, A Philosopher and His Mission to Save Morality. Welcome, David. It's a pleasure to have you on.
It's very nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. And so in his book, David wrote, the chapters in Reading Parfit cover different aspects of reasons and persons, but several of them got Parfit to reflect more deeply about what it is to have a reason to do something, and that drew him into meta-ethics. Take a statement such as, quote unquote, torturing innocent children is wrong. What is its status? How can such a statement claim to be morally objective? What would such a claim to objectivity mean? How should we respond to a skeptic who insisted that it was merely an opinion and no more valid than the diabolical judgment that torturing innocent children was just fine? Thanks very much. How should we respond to the skeptic's cousin, the relativist, who claims that morality is relative to culture? So that what is morally true in London might not be morally true in Lagos or Lahore. So I love that. And then so now starting to think about just Parfit and what he meant to philosophy and who he was. I mean, when you're thinking about sort of the grandiose people or kind of humans in academia, one would think that somebody who tries to make a claim to moral objectivity is quite a bit delusional, right? So how is it that we started taking, first of all, who is Derek Parfit? And then how do we start taking him so seriously?
Well, who is he? He was, because he died in 2017, he was an English philosopher who specialized in moral philosophy. He was born during World War II in China. Both his parents were missionaries. All four of his grandparents were missionaries, and they were in China doing missionary work. They were medics by that stage. And they eventually come back to England. He goes to prep school, which is a kind of paid school here. He then goes to the poshest prep school in the country, which is called Eton, which has a ridiculously kind of outsized role in British life. He then goes to Oxford. He's a historian at that stage, and he then gets a fellowship to America, and that's where he discovers philosophy in the 2 years that he's in America. He goes back to Oxford and basically spends the rest of his life at a college called All Souls in Oxford University. And All Souls is a kind of unusual college in that it's purely for research. It has no undergraduates. It's only for people researching a subject. And so, on the face of it, he doesn't have a very interesting life, but he's a very interesting, we may go on to talk about this, he's a very interesting person. So, on the face of it, it's not very promising biographical material, but he's an unusual personality. Why should we take him seriously? Well, this is not uncontentious, but some people rate him as one of the great moral philosophers of the 20th century. I mean, he has his detractors. It's not universally acknowledged that he's, one of the greats, but he has many disciples, and some people, and a large number of very serious people, think he's one of the most important moral philosophers of the 20th century. So that's why we should take him seriously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and thinking about it just again from the perspective of relativism versus objectivism, how is it that what is it that led him to believe that objectivity was a possibility in moral ethics? Because most of the time the thinking is where it's sort of like secular relativism, which I mean, obviously I think most of our listeners will be familiar with, and then you have kind of religiosity and, the 10 Commandments and the idea of Jesus Christ and the thinking that, we kind of do unto others. But so how does he find the sort of middle ground between the two, where it's not so much religious, but it's not as secular as we tend to consider it?
Well, yeah, he spends the last 25 years of his life obsessed with this one question, which is whether morality is objective in a kind of very strong sense. He has ignored that question up until then because he thought that meta-ethics, which deals with these kinds of questions, he thought meta-ethics was just too difficult. and he couldn't cope with it. So he spends the early part of his life working on very, interesting topics for which really he's most famous. And I think his really the most important work is early on. But then he comes to believe that if morality isn't objective, then none of his early arguments rest on solid ground. And it's only if he can sort of demonstrate that there is this solid ground of objectivity, then that these other arguments he has about morality make sense. And he comes to this very slightly odd view that if morality isn't objective, then his life and all our lives are meaningless. That then we descend into nihilism, or as you say, into relativism, and that isn't nearly good enough for him, because he wants to, as I said in that passage that I read out, he wants to say it's not a matter of opinion that torturing innocent children is wrong. It's not what we happen to believe in the UK or in the US, as opposed to other parts of the world. It's an objective truth wherever you are in time, in space. And that is what he devoted, the last period of his life to trying to demonstrate. To most people's eyes, I think unconvincingly, but he does come up with nonetheless interesting arguments. So it's not entirely wasted, all that work, but lots of people remain unconvinced.
Yeah, can we get into that a little bit? What are those arguments? How did he frame them?
Well, I mean, he has various arguments, but he thought that morality was really a bit like mathematics. So he thought the idea that objectivity had to be, as it were, tangible was nonsense. Physics is objective because we can sort of measure physics, or we can smell it or see it, or we can even if we can't see it, we can measure it with instruments, or we could work it out with mathematics. We could work out what the objective world must be like. And there are standards of evidence, and we can test it and so on. Morality is not like that. On the other hand, he draws a parallel between morality and mathematics. So 2 + 2 is 4 is something which is true, he believed, and many people believe, whether you're in America or whether you're in the UK or wherever you are in the world. But it's not something you can touch. It's a truth that's out there. It's an objective truth that's out there, but it's not something that is tangible or measurable or verifiable or falsifiable or any of these other things that we do with scientific truths. So he thought it was perfectly possible that you could have that kind of objective truth. And he has these various arguments. He has one argument which he calls the argument for Tuesday indifference. And he imagines that you're being offered some kind of terrible sort of pain in the future, and you don't want it, except you're entirely indifferent if it takes place on a Tuesday. You say, I don't mind if it's on a Tuesday, and you know that it's going to hurt just as much on a Tuesday as any other day. He says that is totally illogical. That argument makes no sense. It's just because you believe it and you claim that you're indifferent, it's kind of a ridiculous thing to believe. You can't be indifferent about Tuesday suffering. Suffering is just as bad on a Tuesday as any other day, and anybody who claims the opposite is wrong. So he has these various arguments to show that we have to take suffering seriously, that it's ridiculous not to take suffering seriously. He's desperate to demonstrate to all his opponents that he's right about this, because, as I say, he thinks that you can't get morality off going at all unless you've got these objective truths. So it's a very long book, and I've summed it up there in about a minute and a half. He has lots of other arguments. One of the things he wants to do is to demonstrate that different moral traditions, namely a tradition coming out of Immanuel Kant, a tradition coming out of consequentialism or utilitarianism, a tradition coming out of contractualism, which is the kind of moral philosophy or political philosophy associated with Tim Scanlon, amongst other people, that these are what he calls climbing the mountain from different sides. And his later big book, which was called On What Matters, was initially called Climbing the Mountain. And his metaphor is that all these different moral traditions, they think they've got different views about morality. In fact, they're all climbing the mountain from different slopes. And when they reach the summit, they realize they've got all these things in common. And actually, they realize they agree on all the important things. And that's sort of linked to his idea of moral objectivity, because you couldn't be a moral objectivist and have all these different views about what constituted morality. So he thought morality was objective and that all these different moral traditions were not nearly as different as they imagined.
Yeah, and then so if we're starting to think about it just in terms of an evolutionary perspective, so the philosopher, I know he's a little bit obscure. Many in our audience might not necessarily know him. He was a Finnish philosopher named Edvard Westermark. And so with Westermark, I don't know if he was one of the first, but his thinking was essentially that there's kind of an evolved sense of morality. And so the idea that it wasn't necessarily subjective, but it wasn't objective either. He was a staunch atheist from my vaguish memory of it. And then so my thinking was, when you're thinking about evolution and you're thinking about sort of these intuitions that we have, sort of empathy, right? Sympathy, guilt, let's say regret, right? All of these have to be based on some system of morality. So maybe the system itself hasn't particularly evolved, but would you say that Parfit was kind of more thinking about it in terms of how we respond to unethical issues, or how we respond to, rather, to unethical behavior? That essentially there's this fundamental part of us that says that, you know, there's a kind of inner knowing or an innate knowing of what right and wrong is.
Well, I think he did believe that. And there is the interesting question of how this relates to evolution. So evolution no doubt has thrown up, he doesn't talk very much about this, but no doubt evolution has thrown up a moral system. You know, we've evolved in a particular way. We have moral sensibilities. That makes perfect sense from an evolutionary point of view, because we need to trust each other. You know, if we had no morality, if we all went round in a kind of Hobbesian world threatening each other, society could never get going. We need lots of aspects of morality to flourish. But I think, like Peter Singer, who is regards Parfit as, I think, one of his philosophical heroes, he would take the view that we shouldn't just assume that anything we've inherited from evolution is, as it were, morally correct. That we have all sorts of aspects of our evolutionary inheritance which misfire in a moral way. So, for example, Peter Singer might say, well, we've evolved to eat meat. Obviously, we've evolved to eat meat, but eating meat is something we don't need to do, and it's the way we treat animals is morally totally objectionable. Another example of that might be the way we disregard the interests of people who live on the opposite side of the world. I mean, again, from an evolutionary perspective, it's obvious why we would care about our nearest and dearest, but also why we would care more about people in the next village than people on the other side of the world. And Peter Singer says, from an evolutionary point of view, that makes perfect sense. 150,000 years ago or whatever, we didn't know what was happening on the other side of the valley. But from a moral point of view, we can now see, we can use reason to sort of overcome those moral instincts and those evolutionary instincts, and to acknowledge that we've got some evolutionary hangovers that we need to suppress and adopt a different position. So those are just a couple of examples. So no doubt we have morality because of evolution, but evolution, the morality we've inherited from evolution, is not necessarily the correct morality.
I love it.
That's very interesting, by the way. That you mentioned Peter Singer. I feel like Parfit was sort of the opposite, right? He actually cared more about people distant from him than he did those. He had less regard for people close to him. I believe there was a debate that he had with someone, and World War I was brought up, and he actually wept for a while, right? And had a intense reaction thinking about the suffering of others, right? But in his personal life, he was not someone, like, for example, if one of his friends had a wedding or something like that, he wouldn't necessarily be so inclined to attend it. He'd say he's busy or something like that, which I find very fascinating about him.
Yeah, he was a very interesting personality study. As you say, his moral philosophy, he was a consequentialist, basically. He was a consequentialist with little frills and complications attached. But basically, he believed that what mattered was the consequences of one's actions. And he had lots and lots of arguments about how we got to that position. But when you're writing a biography of somebody, it's interesting to compare their personality to their philosophy. And Parfit was a natural, instinctive, sort of dispositional consequentialist in the way that you said. So most of us care much more about our nearest and dearest and much less about people who we don't know, strangers. Mm-hmm. But Parfit would get very upset talking and reading about the suffering of people who were not only on the other side of the world, they weren't even present. They were historical figures. As you say, World War I used to upset him a great deal, thinking about the suffering in the trenches. And again, as you say, he felt a very weak sense of personal obligation to his closest friends, and because he was so much of a monomaniac and so obsessed with work, he wouldn't give his friends any time for these kind of very important social events like their weddings. And there's a very sad episode in the book in about 2006, 2007, when he's nearing the completion of On What Matters, the second book. He only writes 2 books really in his lifetime, although the second book comes in 3 volumes. He's working on that. He's obsessed about getting that finished. And a former girlfriend who's got very advanced cancer and doesn't have very long to live is in All Souls, as is one of his old friends who's arrived from the US. And they say to Derek, let's all go out for supper like the good old days. And Derek says, sorry, I don't have time. And the person who relates this story, the American academic who relates this story, said to me, I wanted to say, Derek, you're working on this book called On What Matters. Well, this matters. Mm-hmm. But for Derek, what mattered more was his book.
Yeah, and thinking about it in terms of the idea of consequentialism. So we had 2 people on. So we had Michael Shermer on, and then we had Massimo Pigliucci on. And what's so interesting is Michael Shermer says, well, yeah, consequentialism makes a lot of sense. The data can tell us what's right or wrong. And Massimo Pigliucci would say, well, actually, he didn't watch the show, but he knows Shermer's take. He says, well, Michael Shermer, who's my friend, and I agree with him, but I don't think that we can leave philosophy totally out of it. So thinking about this in the context of Derek Parfit, right? What would he say? How would he conceptualize consequentialism, right? Because on the one hand, you have the more social scientific kind of minded, like Michael Shermer, who will say something like, well, the data can kind of tell us everything that what we need to know. And of course, Michael could disagree. Maybe I'm mischaracterizing his kind of understanding or interpretation. But Massimo will say, no, we have to have a fundamental understanding of those values before we actually interpret the data. So how would Parfit would he agree more so with Shermer or Massimo?
Oh, he would definitely believe that you had to have a normative view. The data doesn't tell a story on its own. He would definitely say the data is not enough. You have to have a theory about what to do with the data. So he would definitely take that side of the argument, I think.
Yeah. And then so how would, and then, now we're getting deeper. How do we then now conceptualize what our values are supposed to be, right? Because if the data can't tell us that, when, we're looking at it from a kind of perspective of the world and it's not relative, right? How do we then look at consequentialism in the context of values? Because if let's say we are arguing that values are objective, how can they be so?
Well, he comes up with this, it's actually in an appendix on Reasons and Persons. Reasons and Persons is his first book, and I think it's his most important work, and it's a work of genius, really. It's a brilliant work of moral philosophy. Actually, in the appendix, he comes up with this wonderful sort of tripartite view of how one should judge a life. Which has been very influential, but it's just in an appendix. So on the one hand, we could say, well, what matters, what we need to measure is happiness and pain. So you go around the world measuring how much happiness there is, how much pain, whether this action will produce the most happiness or the most pain. That's one way of doing it. A second way of doing it is to look at preference satisfaction, which is not the same as happiness or pain. So I want to achieve X, Y, and Z. Are my preferences satisfied? That's called the desire approach. A third approach is the objective list approach, which is now, I think, probably the most influential. And that says your life goes best according to an objective list. Whether or not, so your subjective experience, whether you're happy, that's a component of it. It's important that you're happy, but it's not the be all and end all. So let's say you have a subjective preference to count the number of blades of grass that there are in Central Park. Mm-hmm. Okay, so you spend your life counting the number of blades of grass there are in Central Park. So that may make you happy, and that may satisfy a preference, but if, like me, you think that's a total waste of time, that doesn't get you anywhere on the objective list. So the objective list is the important list of things that really matter in life, which part of which will be your happiness, your well-being, but other parts might be things like friendship, achievement, a whole bunch of objective things that aren't necessarily just measured from your subjective experience and how you see the world.
Mm. Yeah, it's super interesting. Yeah, because the thinking is, I mean, this is, I think, where we always get trapped in thinking, what is it that's the right thing to do, and kind of how do we kind of reason to it? So, and Parfit, I mean, from the understanding here is that Parfit, in devoting his life to it, he really thought that there was sort of a way to it. And, I mean, for somebody to devote their life, I mean, yes, there's a bit of grandiosity there, but it's also obviously pretty amazing. So now at the other end, right, with the detractors, so what are the arguments against his understanding of what morality should be?
Well, I'll tell you about the paper that most sort of frustrated him, which gives you an idea what the other side is. So there's a very famous philosopher called Bernard Williams. Mm-hmm. And Parfit and Bernard Williams, well, I think they began as friends and they respected each other. And Parfit always loved Bernard Williams. And I think by the end, Bernard Williams was very irritated by Parfit. But Bernard Williams has this short but profoundly influential paper called something like Internal and External Reasons. And what Williams argues is that you can have internal reasons to do something, that you may want to do something for various reasons, but it makes no sense to say you have a reason to do something whether or not you want to do it. And the example that a rather sort of old-fashioned, objectionable example I think that Williams comes up with is an example of a husband who treats a wife very badly. And you can try and persuade the husband that he should behave differently. And you say to the husband, you're making your wife very unhappy. You could say it's not doing your marriage any good. You could say 1,000 different things to try and convince him. But if at the end of the day, Bernard Williams says, the husband says, well, I accept all that, but I'm still going to carry on treating my wife very badly. Bernard Williams says, well, there's nothing more you can say. That's the end of it. You've tried to persuade this person, you've failed, there's nothing more to say. What Derek wants to say is that the husband has a reason to treat the wife well, whether or not the husband internalizes the reasons. That there is just an objective reason to behave well to everybody, but maybe particularly to your partner, which exists over and above whether the husband thinks there's a good reason for doing it. So the other side says it makes no sense to talk about reasons that don't connect to somebody's desires, to somebody's wants. Parfit doesn't believe that. Parfit says, no, it doesn't matter what they desire, what they want. That person has a reason to do it, irrespective of whether they want to do it, whether they desire to do it. So that's the nub of, that's one nub of the argument between the objectivist and the subjectivist, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I could see a sense to, so when Parfit says that he would have an objective reason, let's say, to treat his wife well, What does well mean here in terms of just in some sort of positive manner, or well in the sense of um, I mean, this is hard because I know this is objective.
Well, I think
Yeah,
he doesn't really need to spell it out. He says, whatever your definition of well is, let's say with respect, with love, however you want to fill out the equation.
Yeah.
Parfit says that equation can be filled out without the husband caring about it. Okay, so whatever you think about what goes into a decent, respectful, loving relationship, you define it. And Parfit says, well, once we've got the definition, once we know what counts as treating somebody well, he doesn't really care about the content so much. I mean, we can argue about that. But once we've got the content, what's important to Parfit is, if we accept that that's what treating somebody well means, that we have a reason to treat somebody well, irrespective of whether we want to treat them well.
Understood. Yeah, I think I was just going in my mind of thinking about conditioning, or maybe whatever might have been going on in that particular husband's mind, external environment, internal environment,
Learn
and then
values.
thinking that, oh, this makes sense. Like, this is well in my mind what is rational in this particular context. But maybe I'm
I mean, you can imagine
wrong.
you could imagine, like, I don't know, a psychopath or a sociopath or something who sort of acknowledges what the content is, and they say, yeah, I understand that I don't know, relationships flourish when you respect each other, blah blah blah,
Right.
and I just don't care. I just don't care.
Yeah.
And Parfit says, well, you're wrong not to care. And Williams says that makes no sense. I can make no sense of the idea that you're wrong irrespective of whether you desire it or want it.
Yeah, and it's a sort of a very Humean perspective, where
Right.
the idea,
Right.
exactly, where the emotions are essentially the
Right.
foundation of your goals.
Right. So essentially, he's arguing against a Humean. So the other side is essentially Humean in a way, and the other side says it has to come from sentiment. That reason is the slave of the passions. It has to ultimately come from sentiment, and Derek says no, it doesn't come from that kind of subjectivity, as it were.
Yeah. We had on Richard Pettigrew, not to shift topics a little bit. We had on Richard Pettigrew, I think it was a year ago, and we talked about identity and Parfit's kind of conception of it. So do you remember when we talked about and this was such an interesting episode. Remember when we talked about the ship, and like, so the idea is like, okay, if you get rid of a little bit about it, is that still you? If you get a little bit rid of more. Yeah, right. Yeah. So do you remember that? Do you want to talk about it a little bit?
Better for you too.
Okay, I hear you. Yeah. So
I can talk about it if you'd like.
Go for it. That's
great.
Go for it.
We're on to personal identity here. So So we've actually sort of, in a way, we've started at end Parfit, and we're going back to early Parfit now. So end Parfit is Parfit and objectivity, which is the last 25 years of his life. The first 15 years of his life, about 15 years of his life, no, a bit more than that, is working on sort of other topics, including personal identity. Personal identity is the question what it is that makes me the same person over time. So how is it that I am the same person now than I was at the beginning of this interview, that I was when I was 5 years old, that I will be when I'm 85 years old, inshallah, that I get there. And he has lots of thought experiments, but one of his thought experiments, he imagines somebody who goes into a teletransporter, a bit like in Star Trek, and is beamed to another planet. And what happens is their molecules are kind of copied, and they reappear in this exact copy on another planet. And then they come back, and they're back on planet Earth, and blah, blah, blah. This keeps going several times, and then one time the person in the white lab says, "Well, this time when you're beamed to planet Mars, the original you will stay where you are, and you can talk to your copy on planet Mars." And it's a bit weird. You're talking to your double, as it were, and your double is just exactly the same as you. It's got the same memories, the same dispositions, thinks it's you. You can see the same shaving cut that you cut yourself in the morning. It's on this other person's face. And then the person in the white lab said, "Oh dear, I've just discovered that as part of this process, unfortunately, you're going to suffer some cardiac failure and you're going to die you'll cease to exist in half an hour, but your copy will continue to exist on Mars. And one of Parfit's kind of central questions is, well, should you care? Should you care that, as it were, the person on Earth disappears, but this exact copy still exists on Mars? And he changes his mind a bit about personal identity, but the one thing that is consistent throughout his philosophical career is that he says that identity is not what matters. You know, whatever you want to call the same person, that's not what matters. The most important thing is that you have psychological continuity, and that persists, so that you have, so your memories survive, your dispositions, your character survives. If that survives, then that's the most important thing. Whether you want to call that the same person or not is much less important than this question of what survives. And if you survive psychologically, if there's a psychological connectedness, that's what matters. And so he thinks that you shouldn't get too upset about the fact that the one on Earth has disappeared and your copy has survived. What matters has survived. And obviously that's a very controversial view. I think many people think, oh my God, I've died. It's merely a copy that's up there. But that's not what Parfit believed.
Well, being that there is that idea of psychological continuity, I can definitely get behind his argument. It's just that I suppose that if I had to place myself in that particular situation, and let's say I was the original. Well, actually, sorry, I should ask this. Are we asking if the clone cares about the original dying, or are we asking if the original cares about the original dying?
Yeah, the original is whether the original.
Yeah. So, I mean, on one level, yes, I would feel better knowing that in some way I would continue. It's just that I would have this sort of illusion of thinking that, oh, this experience is going to just dissipate and end. So it's still, from my perspective, psychological death and something to sort of tackle, at the end of the road. So it's a little rough, but yes, I would like that there's another version of me maybe that can interact with maybe family or something like that. And
right.
Yeah,
so he doesn't change his mind very much about anything else, but he changes his mind a little about psychological continuity, about personal identity, which I can explain a bit if you're interested.
Please.
Well, so he later on he comes to believe that what we are is the psychological stuff, right? But the psychological stuff rests within an organism. Okay, so we're born, we emerge from our mother's womb. At that stage, we don't exist, because what we are is we're this sort of, we've been a fetus, we're newly born, we have almost nothing psychologically. A person emerges from that. The person sits within this organism. Okay, so one way of thinking about it, which a very good philosopher gave me, this is not my metaphor, but it's a very helpful one. It's a bit like a car horn in a vehicle. So the car horn doesn't make any sense without the vehicle, right? The car. You can't have a horn without a car. The car horn only exists because the car exists, but the horn is not the same as the car. So he comes to believe that what we are is that we are people who sit within this biological organism. So we're not the same as that biological organism, but we sit within it. And we rely upon it. So that has important implications for beginning life ethics and for end of life ethics. You might think that if you're brain dead, for example, but your body continues to exist, well, according to this later view of Parfits, you're effectively dead.
Right.
Your body's still there, the organism's still there, functioning, your heart and your lungs and everything's going, but your brain's not there. So the person is no longer there. But your your body's still there. And because he thinks that what matters is psychological continuity, in Parfit's view, you're as good as dead. And you might think of something similar about, let's say, a very early embryo. So, let's say 10 days after conception, where there's debates about whether you can experiment on embryos and so on. Well, Parfit might say, well, you've got the body, you've got the organism, but you don't yet have the person. The person is yet to emerge. And so, again, he would be fine, I think, with experimenting on early stage embryos, because the person emerges within the body, but the person is not identical to the body. Is that clear? Is that comprehensible?
Yeah. And what's so interesting is that just thinking about the kind of doppelganger, I mean, it's so counterintuitive to think that there's another version of you and it's not you, because we think automatically, I think of twins, and the thinking is like, well, twins are everywhere, and it's clearly not the person. I mean, if you look at just twins, if you look at twin studies, a lot of the times you'll have a twin who, some people will joke and say, well, are you the evil twin or whatever? But the idea is that twins are sometimes so distinct that you have completely different people. So the thinking is, okay, even if let's say this doppelganger is a lot like me, it's still not me, and it's so counterintuitive. I just wonder how Parfit would have addressed that.
Well, so he ends up sort of accepting that in a way. So he ends up saying, well, the person on Mars, because they exist in a different organism, right?
Right.
So this is the one thing he changes his mind about. His later view, his mature view, is that the person on Mars is not the same person, is not identical, because it's got a different organism. Nonetheless, he carries on believing the most important message that he has, that what matters has survived.
Right, which is psychological
continuity. So towards the end of his life, he'll say, okay, I grant you, this is not the same person. Okay, it's not identical. The person on Mars that is just a copy is not the same because it hasn't got the same organism. Okay, but it's got what matters. It's got psychological continuity.
I love it. And just, because for time's sake, I want to kind of get into the personal stuff too, because I thought it was super fascinating, especially the fact that you knew him and you worked with him to whatever extent. So David, can you tell us a little bit about your relationship with Derek?
Yeah, so I did first an undergraduate degree at Oxford, and then I did something called the BPhil, which is quite a well-known philosophy degree at Oxford. It's 2 years. You do you used to do, in any case, 3 exams on different areas, and you would do a dissertation. And my dissertation was on obligations to future people. And future people, and our questions about future people, and philosophical questions about how many people there should be, and all sorts of kind of puzzles and conundrums about future people, our responsibilities to future people. It all starts with Parfit. Parfit basically invented the subgenre of the philosophy of future people. And his famous book, Reasons and Persons, comes out in 1984. I do the BPhil starting in 1986. So I study with Derek in, I think, probably 1987. And I do my dissertation on future people. So I study with him then, and then I go off and do a bunch of other things. And then I take a few years off philosophy. I come back to philosophy, and I do a PhD in philosophy. And this time my supervisor is a woman called Janet Radcliffe Richards. And Janet is the woman who marries Derek and was already a partner of Derek. So I was taught by both Derek and by Derek's wife, Janet Radcliffe Richards, who's a well-known philosopher in her own right. So, in fact, I knew Janet better than Derek, but I was in a very good position to write the biography because I knew them both. I knew his sister a little bit. I knew some of his friends. So yeah, that's how I knew Derek. And later on, I had an academic link with something called the Uhiro Centre for Practical Ethics in Oxford, and Derek theoretically had a link with the same institution, and theoretically we shared an office together. So my name was on the office door and his name was on the office door, and a couple of others, but I never saw him. He never turned up. He worked from home. So really the centre liked having an association with him because it was having an association with a great man, but he very rarely turned up at the institution.
No, that's so funny. Yeah, and no, go ahead, Adam.
No, actually, you should continue off of this point.
Oh,
I'll ask about the repugnant.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I was thinking, just because what we would think of when we think of Derek at this point is this was it wasn't a term that was, I think, around at his time, but neurodivergent. So what was that like for you, David, to put your mind into the mind of somebody who is as neurodivergent? Because I'm assuming, for the most part, if, like, let's say atypical exists, you're probably more on the atypical side of the coin. So I would wonder, what was it like for you to actually try to get to understand the inner workings of his mind, and obviously some of his kind of more idiosyncrasies or peculiarities.
Yeah, well, as it happens, I don't know why, I'm kind of attracted to that kind of personality, and
Right.
I don't know whether I understand them or not. I kind of feel like I understand them. I'm more sympathetic to these characters than many are. So I've written about Wittgenstein, who in some ways is a similar character. I've written about Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who I'm much less sympathetic to, but is a slightly similar character. I've written about the chess player Bobby Fischer, who's very, very, very similar.
Yeah.
And I'm no psychologist or psychiatrist. I can't diagnose people, but I spoke to lots of experts in autism. I mean, I think Derek suspected that he was on the spectrum himself, and I found some correspondence where he admits this to friends. And we haven't talked about any of his eccentricities, but there's lots of very strange things that happen to him, and he behaves in a strange way, and he always wears the same clothes every day, and he always has a red tie and white shirt and grey trousers because he doesn't want to waste time choosing what to wear. And towards the end of his life, he's eating the same meal every single day. And his social relationships are very unusual. I found it very easy to get in. Maybe I shouldn't, maybe I've got him all wrong, but it felt to me like I found it very easy to get inside his head and to empathize with him. The big puzzle with Derek, which I didn't realize when I began the book, and then just kind of threw me completely, was that I assumed he'd always been like this. I took on the writing project because I thought Derek was an interesting person to write about, in part because he was so unusual. And then I began to investigate his early life to discover that until he's 25, there were very few indications of this at all. And that suddenly becomes puzzling because, you don't develop autism. And yet the first 25 years of his life, he seems to be sort of popular, has friends, he's got lots of interests, he plays a musical instrument, he goes out, he has lots of girlfriends, he's involved in debating and journalism and all sorts of things. A very, very rich existence. And then towards the end of his life, he's thrown everything away. He's pared everything back, and it's only right towards the end of his life. It's only philosophy and nothing else. And so that genuinely puzzled me, and I'm not sure. I have a go at trying to explain that, but I don't know whether I've got to the bottom of that. That was very, very odd to discover that early Derek and later Derek seemed like, ironically, two different people.
Wow. Yeah, and I'm sorry. I think I said neuroatypical. I meant neurotypical. So atypical is actually the neurodivergent. So yeah, wow, that's so interesting. So yeah, go ahead. You were going to say something.
Yes. So in regards to population ethics, I'm actually very curious about this. What exactly is because I know he's famous for the non-identity problem and the repugnant conclusion. I'm very curious, what is exactly the repugnant conclusion?
So those are two very different puzzles. The repugnant conclusion is the claim that for any set of people, so let's say there are currently 8 billion people on the world, on planet Earth, let's say they all have, which is not true at all, flourishing lives. So for any set of people like that, there is a much bigger set of people, let's say 8 trillion people, whose lives are only just better than nothing. And that scenario, that world, is better than the world in which there are 8 billion lives of very happy, flourishing lives. So the repugnant conclusion is that this second world, this world in which there are trillions and trillions of lives, only just better than nothing, is a better world than one in which there are 8 billion lives, all of which are extremely high quality and do things that you imagine a high quality life will do, and have friends and love and happiness and enough money to live and and enjoy Mozart and good novels and whatever it is that makes up a good life. That second life with trillions of lives just better than nothing is a better universe. And he has lots of arguments for that. And he doesn't want to believe it. He wants to think that conclusion is ridiculous. It's a repugnant conclusion, as he calls it. But his arguments push him towards this repugnant conclusion. And again, it's something he's working on right at the end of his life. He's trying to find the answer to the repugnant conclusion, to show that the repugnant conclusion is false. But he ends up essentially, thinking that we have to accept this repugnant conclusion.
Now, I'm curious, because one of the first thoughts that I have is that in the world where there's 8 billion people versus the world where there's trillions of people. Now, what I'm guessing, or what I'm understanding, is just for the sheer fact that there are more lives, net lives, in the other world, it seems to be the reason why that's better.
Yeah, because they're better than nothing.
However,
it's a calculation. So each of them is worth more than one point. If you think a life that's no better and no worse than nothing is 0, and a life that's just better than nothing is worth 1, and a life that's massively better than nothing is worth, let's say, 100, that if you have enough ones, you get to more than 100.
sure. However, here's one of the thoughts that I'm having, or at least just sort of an impulse intuition, which is just, either way, you're creating in this example, if you have a set number of people and it's limited to 8 billion versus the other example, which is limited to 1 trillion, just because you've set the parameter, it's almost as if you're, why, isn't it arbitrary then?
The repugnant conclusion is not that there's a set number. The repugnant conclusion is, for any number of lives where you have this smaller group, which are happy, there is a number of lives, let's not say what it is, but there is a number of lives which is sufficiently big that it outweighs the smaller number of lives that have very high quality of life.
Okay.
Yeah, so
and that seems to almost everybody you put it to, everybody thinks that can't be right. That cannot be the right answer. It cannot be right that trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of lives, just better than nothing, is better than a life where we've got lots and lots of very flourishing, happy, successful lives.
I suppose, yeah, if I had to take it another step, I guess I could imagine sort of ripple effects of what are the consequences of having so many people. Maybe it's possible.
So you have to put that to one side. You have to assume, because if you say if it has further consequences, let's say it causes climate change and mass extinction, then clearly the trillions of lives are not better than the 8 billion because they'll end up being lower than 0, as it were. So you have to put that assumption to one side, assume that there are no further consequences, as it were, that these trillions and trillions of lives are in fact worth 1 point on the scale of flourishing. But the planet Earth continues to exist and so on. They don't end up fighting and killing each other so that their lives are nothing or worse than nothing. So obviously in actual practice, of course, there would be these further consequences where people, there just wouldn't be enough resources, right? We'd run out of food, people would starve to death, and their lives would be worse than nothing. So put that important assumption aside, and imagine we're populating lots of planets, for example. Again, it can't be the case that 8 billion on planet Earth is better than trillions and trillions, even if there's another on other planets, if their lives are so, they're not worse than nothing, but only just better than nothing. And that's the counterintuitive conclusion he reaches, which he can't believe and doesn't want to believe, and nobody else can believe.
I love it. This is so epic that we're doing active philosophy on the podcast. This is great.
Sure.
All right. And speaking of philosophy, so as we start to wrap up, David, as I'm sure you can probably guess, because obviously, though, not only do we ask you on the podcast, but I'm sure you get listeners all the time telling you this. So for us as sort of younger podcasters, we look up to people like you and Nigel, right? So you guys started the podcast Philosophy Bites. You guys started the podcast in 2007, which to us is, first of all, how does even somebody think to start a podcast in that year when like nobody even really knows what podcasting is, like Rogan, I think, started in 2012. So how did that even come about? How did you guys think, okay, let's do a podcast?
Well, the origin was that it was due to sort of irritation with my part-time day job at the moment, at that time. So I had, a long time ago, I'd made a series on philosophy on the BBC, and I got a fantastic response from around the world. So I worked for the BBC World Service, which was the bit of the BBC that broadcast to the rest of the world. And I did this series where I interviewed some famous philosophers, and about, one was about Aristotle, one was about Nietzsche, one was about Wittgenstein, one was about Kant, one was about Hume, and so on. And I got letters in this was way before email, and I got letters in from all around the world. So people from Lagos would bother to write to me, and they would put their letter in an envelope, they'd put a stamp on it, and they would send it all the way to Bush House, the headquarters of the BBC World Service. I knew I was on to kind of a winner, that there was this big interest in philosophy out there. And I tried to get another series, and I couldn't get it commissioned. And I didn't really know Nigel at the time, but Nigel had helped me a bit with a book I'd written on Rousseau, and he'd invited me to a interview that he was doing with a famous photographer, and I went along. He was a very good interviewer. I was very impressed by him, and he'd also at that stage started putting up on the internet, because he's a kind of techie, chapters of one of his books. I think it was Philosophy and the Classics, and so he was clearly sort of aware of the internet early on, and aware of its possibilities. So I suggested to him that we do this podcast. And I'd actually had a friend who had made a children's podcast and was doing something very clever, was repackaging out of copyright children's stories. So was taking, Alice in Wonderland, which there was no longer any intellectual property rights, copyright over it, and was kind of rewriting them, and was making them available for parents for long car journeys. And it still exists. And at the time, he was getting 40,000 downloads a month. And I thought, wow, 40,000, that's incredible. And now he gets like 1 million a month at least. And so I said to Nigel, I think we could do the same for philosophy. So we started as you say, a long time ago. We had first mover. I mean, we've had now, I think we're up to we only now do about one a month, but we're up to about 47 million downloads, but we had first mover advantage. So I think for years there was no other competition. I'm very pleased to be doing this podcast, but since writing the Parfit book, it's just amazing how many philosophy podcasts have approached me in the last few weeks. I thought, oh my God, we were alone, and now there's quite a few out there now. So, I'm very pleased. The more the merrier, as far as I'm concerned. And as you'll have discovered, there are lots of people interested in ideas and these kinds of issues.
Yeah. And then what was so important in terms of public philosophy, what was so important for you guys in terms of getting it into the mainstream, or what made it so important?
Well, I think we both believed in that. We both thought that there was a sort of demand for that. We're both believers in sort of accessibility, and I think we both think that it's not true of all ideas. There are some very complicated ideas out there which can't be translated into an accessible. We do short podcasts. Ours are like 20 minutes. You can't translate it into 20 minutes, but that's the minority. Philosophy is a very difficult topic. some of the things we've been talking about today are quite personal identity, the repugnant condition. They're quite complicated, and it gets a lot more complicated. There are many areas which are much more complicated. Nonetheless, most philosophy can be made accessible without losing the rigor of it. And I've always thought that there is almost no correlation between the brilliance of a philosophical idea and how accessible one can make that in terms of sort of translating it into things that public can understand. And some of the very great philosophers are very bad at translating their ideas or writing their ideas in a way that most people understand. And some of the very great philosophers are very good at it. So you take somebody like Hegel, I'm sure, a very good philosopher, very difficult to read. You take somebody like Hume, who's, I think unquestionably the greatest philosopher to write in the English language ever. Hume is very easy to read, even though his ideas are so profound and so deep. He writes in a way which is very, very easy to understand. And actually, I think for most philosophical ideas, there's no reason why we can't be more like Hume and less like Hegel. And a philosophy podcast can do that, I think.
I love that. And then, so one of our final questions would be, what advice, and it's okay if you can't think of anything off the spot, but I am really curious. So what advice would you have for younger philosophy podcasts, like in terms of sort of information, things to cover, what would be important for them to know?
Well, I think there are different ways. It's difficult to generalize advice because there are different ways to do it. One thing we went for, I think my main advice is, if you're going to do it properly. That's when people ask me should they start a podcast, I say, actually, it's quite a lot of work. There's quite a lot of reading to do and so on. We edit very heavily because what I want to do is I want every sentence to be worth listening to. And what I've been saying now, 35% of what I've said is total rubbish. And you could remove. It's difficult to remove it on video. It's much easier to remove on audio. You could remove 35% of what I've said without losing any important content, or maybe more, maybe 75%. I don't know. But there's a percentage you could take from me, and the substance wouldn't suffer. But I'd say take it seriously. There are lots of podcasts out there. As there are thousands of podcasts out there. Most of them are rubbish, and they don't pay any attention to quality at all. And you think, well, why is anybody going to bother to listen to that? You've got to. There's so much good stuff out there. The bad stuff is just going to disappear. So if you're going to do it, it's more important than when we started. I mean, we always knew about. I had training in the BBC, so the recording quality was always important to me, as well as the substance of what we were talking about. But I would say, if you're going to do it, make sure you really work at it. Otherwise, don't bother.
I love it. All right, Alan, final questions for David before we wrap up?
Yes. If we wanted to follow you, follow your work, and of course, buy the book, where can we do that?
Well, the book, it's called Parfit, a philosopher and his mission to save morality. And it's in bookshops, or you can buy it on Amazon, or you can buy it from... it's Princeton University Press, so I think you can buy it direct from Princeton, which would be a good thing to do. I don't know. I'm on Twitter. That's about the only social media I do.
Yeah, and what's your Twitter handle?
I'm at David Edmonds 100. I'm not a great Twitterer, but I'm there every now and again.
And of course we can find you on Philosophy Bites, which is available everywhere. Yeah. David, thank you so much for coming on. This was excellent.
Okay, really pleased to do it, and good luck with your podcast.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, man. We'll talk to you soon.
Okay.
All right. Bye. All right.
That was awesome. So everyone, if you'd like to follow us, you can follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook and on Instagram, on Twitter, we're Seize_podcast. Like, subscribe, hit the bell on YouTube. And again, thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.